Well, thank you, everyone. We want to be cognizant of folks' time. Realize that some folks are running on Balkan Standard Time, so they might be a minute or two late. Really excited about the discussion that we're going to have today and appreciate the diversity of perspectives amongst the current audience. We have two real experts who have devoted a considerable amount of time, a good portion of their professional lives, to serving the United States. And they are both, as now civilians and experts, living and working in one in Podgorica, one in Tivat, even better, and one in Belgrade. So I'm going to introduce them both. I would say that this is coming here in the United States the day after the Memorial Day. This is a somber holiday. It honors those who sacrificed so much for the United States. And certainly in the region, there's so much happening as economies are reopening. The tourism season that drives the economy is upon us. So I think we'll have a discussion that'll go rather quickly. As with our other discussions, these last just about 45 minutes. So please chime in if you have questions, raise your hands, we'll unmute you. I would also just suggest for those of you who are new and have not visited BalkanInsider.com, please do. It was a little less than 3 years ago that I decided to found this, and with the incredible assistance of Ryan Sherba, who will be joining and helping moderate this, we have grown to be the only morning newsletter in the that covers this amazing region. So I would turn it over, I suppose, first to John Cappello in alphabetical order to give a 3 or 5 minute introduction of your background, John, and then we'll turn it over to our next guest, Darren Evans, to do as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Ari. First of all, I apologize for my voice. I woke up yesterday and I'm gonna have to have a sip. I woke up without my voice yesterday, so I apologize. Ari, Ryan, thank you for having us and for all you do with Balkan Insider. I think it's great. It's a great job, and I've enjoyed working with you for the past couple of years. For those of you who do not know me, my name is John Cappello. I retired from the United States Air Force after serving 25 years. I ended my career with 2 Defense Attache assignments in Belgrade from 2007 to 2010. And then I went from here to Tel Aviv from 2010. Stayed there almost 6 years, the longest I've lived anywhere in my adult life. After that, like I said, retired from the United States Air Force, went back to DC, did some work in the policy arena at the Foundation for Defense and Democracies, and I've been back in Belgrade more or less for the last 2 years. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer those, but that's a big overview.
Darren, an Air Force guy, just set the bar pretty high. What can an Army guy do to top it?
Thank you, Ari, Ryan. It's great to see you guys tonight, and thanks for everybody joining in. As Ari said, Balkan Insider, it's been around for a couple of years, and it really is the daily bread for a lot of us out here in the regions. So I'm in Tivat, Montenegro. I've been here now for 5 years, 7 years total. I'm a career military officer. I retired in 2015 after serving my final 2 years as a Defense Attache to Montenegro. That was in a run-up to NATO. Shortly after my departure, Montenegro received their invite. My background as a military officer, I was a Special Forces officer for almost my entire career. Midway through the career, I went to Georgetown and got a grad degree in Eurasian Studies. And that set me up for working in embassy assignments such as John worked. And I worked in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and then finished it off here in Montenegro. I think the most significant aspect of my career that's applicable to this conversation tonight is first my assignment and mandate in Montenegro and their lead up to NATO. And then I had the opportunity in 2005 to attend the Russian Combined Arms Academy. And that's a lot of the conversation discourse here in the region is East-West oriented. And so I feel fortunate to have been one of only 4 Americans who've ever attended the Russian Combined Arms Academy. And actually, I tell people that more Americans have walked on the moon than have attended that academy. And it gave me quite a unique perspective on East-West relations. And it's helped me since 2005 understand a lot about what's going on in the region and globally with great power competition. So I found myself in Montenegro via Bosnia as a peacekeeper initially. I had Serbo-Croatian on my language record, and that's how I ended up almost going to work for John in 2010. Got bypassed Afghanistan for a few years, but then ended up here in Montenegro. So thank you. That's a brief introduction.
Well, the thanks
Thank
goes
you
to
both
both
for
of
your
you.
service. And so we're going to start this off with a quick question to John that might be very heavily loaded. So one of those years that you were as the Defense Attache in Serbia, 2008, Kosovo declared independence. What was that experience like leading up to that date, February 17th? And were you in communication with the U.S. office in Pristina at the time? Unfortunately, the embassy was attacked, and even the other day it was mentioned that they're still looking into the case and prosecuting people for that. So what was it like being there as a part of the U.S. embassy there?
That was as you can imagine, there was a lot going on during that time, and it was a very busy time. It was a very busy time, and it's important to kind of have some context, because what happened on the 21st of February, when I stood outside the embassy and watched it on fire, and what people saw on CNN, that didn't happen in a vacuum. And the lead up to that was a set of important activities and events, and it was actually really important in forming my understanding of Serbia and the region. About a week prior, there was a week prior to the recognition of Kosovo, there were a lot of demonstrations, and one of them took place in front of the Slovenian consulate near Kalemegdan. And I walked out to that particular demonstration, and something that struck me right away it was really peaceful. There was families, people rolling their children in baby carriages, and it was a gathering of people who were wanting to share their opinions and share their concerns. And that was in marked contrast to a week later, the first protest in front of the U.S. embassy. So the recognition still hadn't occurred, but it was about the 17th or so. This first protest in front of the U.S. embassy, and it was a very different dynamic. I noticed it was all men. It was all young men. There were people drinking. They were singing songs, but it was a very different dynamic, if you will. The police were out in front of the embassy, and soon one bottle flew, a second bottle flew, and pretty soon that crowd was fighting the police, and the police acted professionally. They protected the United States embassy, and they took a beating for it. Really, I had nothing but the utmost respect watching that, and I had to be careful myself. But then the recognition occurred. And during that time period, the official rhetoric started to ratchet up. I remember Ambassador Munter at the time talking about how this type of rhetoric was not helpful, that it could incite and lead to violence. And that's what happened on, I believe it's the 21st, when the embassy, there was a big protest throughout Serbia. People came to Belgrade. There was a big march to the Ham, and then after that, groups broke off and rioted in different places in Belgrade. One of the first places that was attacked was the United States Embassy, and people are familiar with that, with the photos of the outer structures of the embassy on fire. And so I think it's important to say, even watching that, standing outside watching the embassy on fire, I never, ever once felt personally at risk or under threat. On the contrary, actually, I received dozens and dozens of text messages and calls at the time of my Serb colleagues and friends, expressing remorse and seeing if I was okay. And even during that very difficult time, the political situation was tenuous and very difficult, but our relationship with the Ministry of Defense at the time, it slowed, but it never broke, and we continued our lines of communication, cooperation as much as possible. So this distinction between this political challenge and the people-to-people relationship and the other professional relationships, I think was eye-opening, and it struck me too that look, generally Serbs are moving on a path towards Euro-Atlantic integration. They were then, and they continue to do so now.
Darren, you were in the region just a few years later, from 2013 to 2015. Your posting at our embassy in Podgorica. Montenegro was not even in adolescence as a country, but had begun the journey to NATO. I remember we first met in the fall of 2013, and I'm curious, as you look back now, I guess 3 years next month of Montenegro officially being a NATO member. What was that period like during your posting?
Thanks, Ari. In short, it was pretty optimistic. The country and the leadership knew the direction they wanted to go, and they were willing to do whatever it took to make the positive steps in that direction. For the administration then, as the administration now, it's about Euro-Atlantic integration. And so as part of my mandate, it was to determine whether, I won't say they deserve it, they deserved NATO. It was more, what else do we need to know about Montenegro in order to invite them into Montenegro? And I worked 2 years right alongside my colleagues in the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and answered every question that was given to us from Brussels or from Washington, D.C., and helped paint the picture of a country that was ready to become an active and contributing member of NATO.
Can we just tease that out a little more? And I'm seeing such great diversity of participants who are joining us. What was kind of a typical week for those who visited Montenegro? And in many respects, it's 3 different countries. You have the mountain villages up in the border regions. You have the sea coast, and then you have Podgorica. So was your task primarily in the capital where you were living and working, or were you out and about? And if so, out and about, was this engagement with Montenegrin government leaders, community leaders? You could speak to that. We do have some folks who joined us not too long ago for a discussion we had with the Macedonian diaspora. We all applaud North Macedonia's admission to NATO. So maybe we could just, there's always the ideal of NATO enlargement. So maybe we could just speak in granular detail about what all that entailed during your time.
Sure. I think the biggest question that visitors and NATO leaders have when a country is preparing to join NATO is, what does that country bring to the table? What is that country going to offer to NATO? And so a lot of my daily duties was shaping the message from the Ministry of Defense and the government of Montenegro, and to aligning it with how my country, Washington, D.C., leadership there understands things. For instance, I'll give you a very, very good point on this. Is right after I arrived, I received the contribution to Afghanistan brief from the Ministry of Defense. And they laid out their numbers on their contribution. And it wasn't only to Afghanistan, it was the anti-piracy mission off the Horn of Africa, and several other smaller deployments. So they gave me their numbers in their briefs. And after the brief, I said, okay, I think we can message this and get it clearly understood and better understood if we use percentages instead of numbers. Because as everyone is aware, Montenegro is 650,000 people. Their armed forces is around 2,000 people. So when you throw numbers up on a slide, it doesn't resonate as well as percentage of your armed forces that has supported NATO operations. And so the percentages, it looked much better. So that was a lot of my daily duties, was just translating between government of Montenegro bureaucracy and United States government bureaucracy, so that we're all speaking the same language. We're not going to see, in the case of the numbers, their contribution is, there's more people on leave in a United States Army brigade than they deploy to Afghanistan. But percentage-wise, it looks much different. And that's where we had to place the emphasis. Now, additionally, a lot of my responsibility was really discussing Russian influence in Montenegro. What is Russia's influence? They're buying property. They have businesses here, and we quickly shut that down by comparing property purchases in New York and Miami. If we're going to judge influence by property purchases, then we need to look at New York City and we need to look at Miami. So let's just not have that conversation. Let's look at what the government of Montenegro is stating, what their goals are, and the steps they're taking to reach those goals. And finally, a lot of my responsibilities revolved around the partner capacity development. As we're engaging at the strategic level in their messaging and making sure that it's clear, we're speaking common language. We were also working at the tactical and operational level to help them understand NATO procedures, NATO techniques, and NATO reporting.
Can I ask, so just as a reminder, we have some folks who've joined the discussion a little late. You can certainly raise your hands. We'll unmute you and feature you if you have questions for our two guests. And just to bring everyone up to speed who joined late, Darren used the word here. So we also have the good fortune that Darren is in Tivat, overlooking the sun setting, I'm sure, on the Adriatic, and John is up in Belgrade. So I would just be curious, these are historic and challenging times. The last 2 months, maybe start with you, John, of what's it been like to be an American, an expat, now a civilian, living and trying to work in Belgrade, and then Darren, same with you and your family down in Tivat.
Well, I think the challenge is one that people are facing around the world. I mean, the uncertainty of the COVID virus, understanding how to react, how to respond, I think is as you mentioned, challenging everywhere. And so, as individuals, we find it confusing, but governments are responsible. Governments need to find a way to respond, to somehow instill confidence in the population, to protect the population as best as possible. And these things are done without full knowledge or full understanding, I should say, of how this virus really affects individuals. I've been, honestly, I think the government tried very hard to protect people at the beginning, but Serbs are no different than everyone else. People don't want to be locked up in their apartments. People complain and are not happy that we have to separate and be separate, but that's a human condition, I guess. I think the government spent the first 2 months of this process working hard to minimize the damage that the disease was having on the population. And I think their efforts seem to have worked out. I think the cases peaked at about 10,000, just over 200 deaths, unfortunately. But it could have been much worse. In terms of how I've been treated or accepted here, the same as Serbs treat me all the time. I mean, with a great amount of enthusiasm and hospitality. Wait in line with a mask like everyone else, but people are happy to see that we're sticking with it. So.
And Darren, what's the report from down there on the Adriatic coast, which we can assume will probably have significantly less tourists than this time last year?
Yes, I think there's going to be a drop in tourism this year. There already has been. So I think Montenegro has been one of the best places to ride out the coronavirus. I actually wrote an op-ed for local media at the end of March discussing that same point, is that the government made the right decisions early. They used common sense in the implementation of the rules that they set up. And I think geography also played a role in Montenegro's response. As you're aware, our population centers are separated by geography, and I think that helped. But bottom line, the government took care of business early on. They put in the necessary restrictions on movement in and out of the country and within the country, that we ended up with 314 cases and unfortunately 9 deaths. But I think overall it could not have been a better situation given the spread of that virus globally. Now the impact is going to be terrible this summer. If we look at say a scale of 0 to 10, we're at 0 right now. We don't have any visitors from outside the country. And if 10 is the first week of August in a typical summer, I think this year we may hit a 5 in August. Next year, probably a 7 or 8. But I think realistically speaking, as far as tourism, it's going to be 2022, summer 2022, before we see the rebound to the levels of summer 2019. But I think that's globally. It's not just confined to Montenegro. The economic implications of this are going to be felt for the next couple of years around the world.
Can I ask, I'm curious, this is something that Balkan Insider has covered, and for those of us joining, we have a diverse audience. If you have not visited balkaninsider.com, which we founded less than 3 years ago, please do. Please sign up for our morning newsletter, which is the only morning newsletter that covers this fascinating region. What we do is we synthesize news and occasionally, like we're doing today, produce our own original content. We've covered a lot, a term that now is quite commonplace here in Washington, mask diplomacy. And it's not necessarily just the Chinese, whether it's private individuals such as NBA players or certainly Gulf Arab interests and Turkish interests, but curious, the two of you, as an American, watching the evening news over there, how do you think it's being portrayed as, a big Airbus or Boeing aircraft with PPE, is the term we've all learned, personal protective equipment, lands either at the Belgrade airport or the Podgorica airport?
Well, early on, the crisis left many countries trying to fend for themselves and trying to figure out what to do. I mean, we watched the situation in Italy deteriorate, and it was just disastrous. Other European countries soon followed, closing down, and countries on the periphery. I mean, Serbia was trying to figure out what it should do, who to turn to, who could support. When there were so many questions about how hard the virus would hit, the country. As a little time passed, I think the European Union did respond very well. There were some other countries, the Chinese, the Russians, provided some assistance as well. But look, I think this is an interesting question. I don't think the EU necessarily provides assistance to gain publicity. And I think the other variable there is that sometimes the West, the United States, the other Western European countries forget to kind of tell our story and why we do what we do and how we do it. So in some ways, we lost the narrative a little bit. I mean, I lost track of how many planes, aircraft came from the European Union. So, you know, there weren't a lot of EU signs here, and there were Chinese signs. It's not to denigrate what the Chinese did, but the narratives were different.
Yeah, I agree with John. From the US, we probably lost the narrative and support during this virus to Serbia and Montenegro. I think the US donated 300,000, whereas there were planes from China, United Arab Emirates that arrived, several from UAE. And what I like about what I respect about the Montenegro government is they maintain bilateral relations with many different countries. And in the case of coronavirus, any assistance was appreciated and is appreciated. And I can't say that I think it would be wrong to implicate any assistance as a propaganda ploy. Bottom line is you're getting equipment to people that need it. And just as in Serbia, the first few days of this in Montenegro there was a lot of rumors about which way it's going to go, how bad is this going to be? Because remember, we're living in a region that survived the 90s. So the region as a whole understands and has a frame of reference for catastrophe. And I sat down with several of the American teachers from our school and explained that to them at the onset of this, because we had runs on bread and toilet paper and such. And I told them, just give it time. You have to understand the frame of reference for a 45-year-old living in Tivat, Montenegro. They understood the sanctions from the 90s. They understood going without. And nobody wants to do that again. So all of the aid was appreciated. And again, this government I respect because they do maintain those good bilateral relations, from China to Armenia. They maintain them in a good way.
Thanks, guys. We have our first question. A woman named Maria. You're now unmuted, and if you'd like, you're welcome to start your video and ask our two guests what's on your mind.
Yes, hi. I wanted to ask, I used to work in Afghanistan on the side of the World Bank Group, and there was also a large, I think about 100 soldiers from Macedonia at that time. That was like 2006, 2007, which was a part of ISAF in Afghanistan. So I was just wondering, since Montenegro didn't have that experience at all, what would you think now, since Macedonia is more familiar with NATO operations and ISAF at the time? What do you think, how are the things going to develop now? Thanks.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks for tuning in. 2006 was actually Montenegro's independence. So it took them a few years to really reorganize their military and prepare for NATO deployments. And don't quote me on this, it was around 2010, 2011 timeframe when they deployed their first contingent to Afghanistan. So they started a little bit later in supporting Afghanistan, but they did support Afghanistan, and they continue to support missions around the world for NATO. And I don't know if you're trying to compare Macedonia with Montenegro. There really is no comparison. They're two different independent countries. Montenegro is doing what it needs to be NATO interoperable and to fulfill all the requirements to continue to be a contributing member to NATO.
I think something, if I may just add to that, Maria, I was at European Command, working in the strategy division when about that time frame, and Macedonia made a very clear commitment to NATO to participate in missions abroad, and they did so, I think, for a few reasons. I believe they believed in the mission, but I think, as Darren said, they saw an opportunity to interact with NATO as a professional organization, to build their interoperability, and then in the long run build a capacity to where they would be considered seriously for as an active participant in the NATO structure. They got a little sideline with the name issue, but they were preparing themselves for integration into the Euro-Atlantic space. And I give the Macedonian government at the time, I remember General Stoyanovsky was the chief of defense, give them a lot of credit for making that decision as a non-NATO member to participate so aggressively in the NATO structure.
So I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into the Russian influence in the region, particularly militarily. In Serbia, they bought 6 MiGs, 4 helicopters. They got an additional 4 MiGs from Belarus. Yet in 2019, they did 17 exercises with NATO members versus 4 with Russia. Now Hoyi famously said, or infamously said, you can't sit on 2 chairs at once. But it appears that Serbia is doing just that with where they're getting their military hardware from versus who they're conducting exercises with. So how do you see that playing out in the long run? I mean, a lot of Serbia's neighbors are in NATO or aspiring NATO members. So what's the relationship now vis-a-vis Russia, and also where do you see them going? And then for Darren a little bit, 2017, you saw the assassination attempt of Milo Djukanovic, which was found out to be Russian operatives. So Russia clearly has a strong presence in the region. And just how will the U.S. be able to combat that? Multifaceted question.
Listen, Ryan, I'm not telling anybody what chairs to sit in. I don't think that's helpful. But listen, the point is well taken. Again, this idea of why we do things why the United States or NATO through the Partnership for Peace operates with Serbia. We're not doing it for publicity. We're doing it because we believe that it is in our interest and the interests of the Serbian government to build a strong partnership, right? And we do that through actions. Darren talked about. Let's look at their actions and see if they are in fact moving towards the goals that they've set for themselves. So we work closely with them because we want Serbia to be a strong, stable, prosperous nation that provides stability within the region. And this is why we dedicate resources and effort to working here. And I think the numbers do speak for themselves. You look at their relationship with the Ohio National Guard, continues to be a strong and robust relationship. Substantive activities across the spectrum. You mentioned exercises, but there are over 100 activities. I mean, there's training, exchanges, other opportunities, and they're not met by their relationships with the East. And that's okay. So I think in the end, we're moving we're moving the ball in the right direction. We continue this cooperation. How it's portrayed is actually something we need to reconsider. We need to talk about, because I think the narrative is quite frankly part of the issue. If we're going to build that strong relationship and show ourselves as partner, well, that should expand into our discussions among the public as well. And that's not to say that the Ministry of Defense doesn't. Every exercise we do, every activity we do, they put press releases out there. But that may not be the most effective way to communicate to the public the strong and deep relationship that we have.
And I'll just add a little bit. I see we had a hand raised. Listen, I don't think the view of Montenegro should be, or the region should be derailed by perceptions of Russian influence. Economics are going to define the future of the region, not necessarily influence from countries that may be opposed to Euro-Atlantic integration. Euro-Atlantic integration is a goal because it supports the economic base of Montenegro. And that's really how the future is going to be shaped. Is, can you provide an education for your children? Can you provide jobs for your people? And if you ask the typical Montenegrin, the typical, I would dare say Bosnian or Serbian, would you rather go to a university in the United States or Brussels, or would you like to go to a university in Minsk or St. Petersburg? Now, St. Petersburg maybe is a beautiful city, but you get my point. We're moving away from the kinetic. We've moved away from the kinetic fight. The nefarious influences of security services are always going to be part of a nation's foreign policy. It's part of the U.S. foreign policy. It's part of China's foreign policy. We've arrested Harvard professors for alleged activities with security services. So that's just a part of world politics that are going to be there. But really, the Euro-Atlantic pathway is about the economic well-being of the country, and that economy will pull you further and further away from the kinetic aspects of the alliances.
Hey, Ryan, can I just jump back in real quick? I just want to address, I didn't address the question you talked about hardware, purchases of hardware. Look, I think we have to look at this in a more nuanced fashion as well. Countries in the region struggle to determine how to recapitalize their militaries. They're operating with old equipment, things that may not be capable any longer. And so determining how to reform a military and recapitalize it in a way that it defends the country, that it's able to actually have capability, is a really difficult national decision. And you look at the Serbian Air Force as an example. Look, they made a very difficult national decision to determine the Serbian Air Force was in a position of atrophy. I mean, they had to make a decision whether they were going to continue as a flying organization, a professional flying organization, or a flying club. They couldn't afford new fighters, right? So the Gripen and new F-16s were out of the question. Like other countries in the region, Romanians, Bulgarians, Croatians, they were looking for alternatives for fighter aircraft. And the most practical, maybe more cost efficient. Look, would I rather them have purchase US or Western equipment? Yes, because of the interoperability, because of the relationship it continues to build over time, yes. But in terms of a practical matter, it was kind of stemming the flow of, to prevent in this case, the Air Force from atrophying any further. These reforms are extremely difficult. It takes a huge amount of political courage to change the direction and the equipment that the militaries throughout the region have used in the past. And I think with closer relations, the idea of the importance of interoperability will become more apparent and more important, and hopefully we'll see transition here, but in other places we're seeing it. So.
I think that it would be remiss to say, though, that when the State Department comes out with statements saying that sanctions could be on the table, yet Serbia wants to join the EU and basically be a little bit more aligned with the West. That does throw up a lot of red flags.
Yeah, in terms of the, we could spend a whole hour talking about the sanctions against the Russian corporations and the recapitalization of air defenses. That is complex. There's no doubt about it.
We had a hand go up from Mirza. Mirza, if you still have a question, you're now unmuted, and you're certainly welcome to speak on video as well. We do have a little less than 5 minutes. We're cognizant of everyone's time. Mirza, the mic is unmuted.
Oh, hi there. How are you today? Sorry, but I'm at work also, so I'm trying to listen in as I'm working. I apologize. I was listening to part of it, and understand the focus is more on obviously Serbia and Montenegro, but where does Bosnia figure in this whole picture? Because the way I see it, again, my layman's term, and not there. Obviously there's influences with Russia within Serbia, but also part of Bosnia with the Republika Srpska. And the stability of Bosnia is paramount to the region. I would dare say to the European Union. What is your thoughts? What are your differences? What could be done? Because Bosnian military is one of the few actually government thing that seems to be working, even though Milorad Dodik is trying to push that out. When you look at Croatia and look at Serbia, I'm not sure about Montenegro, but they have a mandatory service in the military to an extent. Bosnia is probably the only one that doesn't have the thing. So, now let me say this, I identify as a Bosniak, so just to be full force over here. So I'm just trying to see how does Bosnia figure into this whole thing. That's all.
So guys, that's a great question. I'd be real curious also during your postings to what extent you traveled to Sarajevo, to what extent you interacted with your counterparts in Sarajevo. Obviously, that's an incredibly large U.S. mission there. So that's probably going to be our last question, and then we'll have time for some concluding remarks. But John or Darren, either one.
I'll just really very quickly say we are doing some work with folks in Sarajevo and in Republika Srpska and some other places in Bosnia. Look, stability in Bosnia is extremely important. I think for a little too long we've maybe taken it for granted, and we can't any longer. It's I think the European and NATO structures understand the importance of continued cooperation and building strong and substantive relationships. So Bosnia is important. I don't know how else to say that.
Yeah, there's only so much you could say. It's at the heart of the Balkans. So instability in Bosnia reverberates across all of Southeast Europe and Europe. We saw that in the 90s, and hopefully we never see that again. I think the U.S., as much emphasis as they're putting on Serbia, Kosovo discussions, they need to put that same emphasis on Bosnia. You know, the Dayton Peace Accords, what are they, 20 something years old now? We need to revisit that and stay engaged in the region. There is a lot of outside investments coming into Bosnia, some from the East, as we know, but there's also investment coming from Germany. You know, Bosch has a manufacturing plant, forget the town, but there's room for investment from many different circles in Bosnia, just like there is across the Balkans. And we have to stay engaged as a government in Bosnia and its future.
Well, gentlemen, I really want to thank you both for your time, your perspective, your insight. I feel like we could do this for many, many more sessions. We just scratched the surface in some regards, and I apologize. I know there were other hands that were raised. Also, just point out the diversity of participants. I'm seeing a former U.S. ambassador, the diplomats from across the region, both posted in the region, and then also here in Washington. And then other experts and interests. And that's just a demonstration of the daily readers of Balkan Insider, as the two of you are. So one last plug, would encourage everyone to visit balkaninsider.com, sign up for the daily free morning newsletter. And particularly want to thank Ryan, who will have the last word.
Well, again, thank you both, Darren and John, for coming on, particularly just after Memorial Day. Which is near and dear to many, many Americans. And so just thank you for taking the time and hopping on, I guess it's around 7:45 in Belgrade and Tivat. So just thank you guys. And if you have any concluding remarks, the floor is yours.
Go ahead, Darren.
Montenegro is corona free. We're the first in Europe. Come visit. We're going to open the borders next month. Come visit.
Okay, I'll come. Listen, Ari, Ryan, thanks again for what you're doing. I think, you know, I don't think it's a stretch to say that the Balkans are not the highest priority for many foreign policy and decision makers, but it needs to be a higher priority. You know, I think we could do more than one thing at a time. We're sitting in Europe right now. You know, Darren and I are sitting in Europe, but it's a place that's not fully integrated into the European space. And that's long overdue. I remain optimistic and again, look forward to talking to you guys more and working with you and moving this ball forward. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.